This video was produced by
Well, thank you for allowing Kate and I to spend a little bit of time with you today to share a little bit about what the Embodied Learning Project is, what we've been doing with it, and hopefully creating some space for you to have some fun with this as well. The title of the talk we thought was really helpful and an opportunity to spend time with other faculty on campus from diverse disciplines, because in fact finding this common ground between science and arts is a passion that I'm sure many of us share, but the nuts and bolts and how to get that done is actually more complicated. How do you actually find common ground for artists and for scientists? So as two examples of where Kate and I came from, we were in common ground, but we found ourselves coming from very different perspectives, or standing in different ground, trying to find a common place to stand. So I'll allow you a little moment to read some words of Kate's early on in this project, and then some of my words early on in this project as a way to sort of exemplify for you some of the challenges that we as professionals experienced stepping into trying to find common ground. So Kate, your challenges. You want to summarize your challenge?
And this quote is from reflecting on many decades ago when I was an undergraduate dance student and took anatomy for the first time, and I got a D in it, and it was just because the professor was trying to move me through. I had no sense of why it was a relevant subject, and I had no sense of my ability to comprehend the study of anatomy, because I thought it was science. I was in art, and that they didn't have any sense of mixing or relevance.
And then I selected this experience that I had spending day one, literally, with Kate's dance anatomy class. And it literally was the introductory component of anatomy. And the experience of stepping into a room with dancers, approaching the study of anatomy, my anatomical head, turned literally inside and out. And I remember Kate looking at me that first day going, "Are you okay?" Because she literally saw the look of confusion on my face, where I have come at my study and my teaching of anatomy from a very health or clinically oriented perspective. And quite frankly, it's usually patient-oriented. And supposedly, the patients are always laying on a table in this position, which is classically called anatomical position. So my brain orients to anatomy in this static, false, in many ways, position. And as I said, we don't move through the world like that. And so on day one, Kate's approach and entry for her students was just diametrically opposed to the way that I started. So day one of our two classes are unrecognizable to each other. Then something wonderful came about. You and I have been grappling with that, for a decade or two. Mm-hmm. I remember the 90s when you and I were sharing our passion for anatomy and our struggles for anatomy. But the Embodied Learning Project, sort of the catalyst to that project, was an opportunity that Kate had to learn a really important piece from Claire Porter called Namely Muscles. You want to say a sentence about that? Or?
And Namely Muscles is, Claire is a choreographer who works with text and movement, and she created this piece based on a character who is a forensic autopsy anatomist who is also a poet. So the central premise of the piece is a book of poems, that she's doing a reading of poetry about muscles. And so Claire made the piece because she wanted to know more about muscles. She wanted to know more about anatomy. So as an artist, she knew that the way she learned was to create about that, to do her research as an artist and create about that. So when she was finished, she had an hour and 10-minute performance that explores 68 of the major muscles of the body. And it's a piece that gets performed for medical audiences and theater and dance audiences alike across the spectrum. And, so when I got going on this project, I asked Sharon to be my anatomical consultant for it.
And when I wasn't laughing, because it is a phenomenally deep piece. Claire is an exceptional anatomist. Every time Kate was doing some choreography that pushed my understanding of anatomy, I would go back and dig for not the introductory kinds of movements, but the more advanced kinds of movement. And sure enough, Claire had it, and it was spot on. And so what really came out of this is like, Kate, what happens if we do this in the classroom setting? This is a performance piece. What about mixing some things up in the classroom? And so that's sort of where our common ground began to come in, is as we launched into some pilot phases of the Embodied Learning Project that we'll share with you a little bit later, where those were and what the populations of students were and how that has worked out. We found ourselves sort of capturing, well, what was it then that made it possible to find common ground, to really launch an embodied learning project with diverse students, and quite frankly, from my perspective, take that risk. Because it is very different, it's very complex, and you're merging students from very diverse perspectives. So Kate, your insight?
Yeah, as we started working together and playing together, I realized that what I had previously kind of constructed as two really separate worlds, you know, the way scientists think and the way artists think, I had constructed that in my mind as being really separate and in some ways opposed. But I found in this particular scientist, I realized, well, we're being driven by the same forces, you know, curiosity, wonder, taking risks, experimenting, leaping into the unknown, that these were the shared experiences of the scientist and of the artist. And that was kind of quite enlightening for me.
And as a scientist, I know exactly what it's like trying to get persons from diverse disciplines to immediately be faced with the beginning of that experience by sort of meeting and interacting with folks who do things and think about things in really unfamiliar ways. Remember what you all just went through with us. And having my own experience with a science student's probably like, oh boy, you know, do we have to dance? And I think that's one of my favorite quotes, not just from our initial concerns, but from students. Science students are like, I don't dance. Do we have to dance? Do we have to move? And of course, the dance students are like, do we have to use the words? Right?
Yeah. And not only words, but Latin words.
Yeah, the ones that don't even come in English. So it's very much a language, a movement. It's a preconception, misconception dilemma of trusting, taking that risk to step into a learning environment that is very atypical and really uncommon. Knowing and trusting that we thought that something really wonderful would come out of that. So shall we start by having them?
Yes. So anybody who doesn't have a party favor, who came in after we gave out the party favors,
Who's not got a
would
party
you be
favor?
willing to come over here and sit here?
Really, because I actually am skipping class.
Would you be willing to come
I'll
over
fill
here
it.
then? And
Don't tell anyone.
how about, would you two be willing to come over here? We're just going to give you a little play thing.
There's one, the last of the numbers.
Okay. Would you mind getting them,
But that group is all number.
get a thoracic, you think? Okay. Thanks. All right. So this is just a quick experiential sample of some of the ways that we approach teaching anatomy to diverse audiences. I meant learners. Thinking as a performer here. If you will just close your eyes, and it means you have to put your muffin down, David, I'm sorry. Don't get confused. Don't get confused and put this hand in your mouth. Okay, so close your eyes and just take a moment to tactily explore.
Yeah, it's easier to close your eyes and
This
see. You don't have to
object
think
that you
about standing
have.
up and feeling.
Ellen smells it, that's good. So you're trying through your hands to take in as much information as possible about this object as a form. Where are the parts that stick out? Where are the openings and the passageways? So using that tactile sense to research this object and take in as much information as possible. And trying to create in your mind's eye a mental picture of this. So translating from the tactile to a visual image in your mind's eye. Ask yourself if there are any gaps or holes in that picture. And if you develop a question, open your eyes and see if the visual sense maybe fills in that gap. And then after you've answered that question for yourself, what does that look like? Then close your eyes again. Fill in that mental image. And then you can go ahead and open your eyes and turn it around, look at it if there's any other questions that you have that you feel visually curious about. Excuse me. And now I'm going to ask you to put it down and use your hands to create a sculpture of this object. Use both your hands to make a representation three-dimensionally of this object with as much detail as possible. Again, where are the places that poke out? Where are the places that dip in? Where are the openings? You can look at it if you would like. If you want to, if you get curious about a detail and you feel like you want to look at it, feel free. But get as much information as possible about the form of this object three-dimensionally. Good, great, great, great. And then just share it amongst your group. Share these amongst your groups. What's that? So, Sharon, you want to add in some vocabulary here?
Absolutely. So, let's see. Can we start with the four of you?
So you can relax your hands, the rest of you, or you might get some cramps.
So let's go here, and if you all can sort of visually scan on the hand sculptures that this group has created.
If you want to get up and come over, you can do
You're
that.
welcome to come over and do that. Who wants to be our first converser? Go for it. All right. There are some structures that are represented here by the hands. Okay. You've got your hand in this circular position. Are you representing this?
Yeah, flip the other way.
Flip the other way. That way?
No, flip over, no, one more. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Okay, good. Okay. Then there's the hole. Is this hole that hole? Do any of you over here have this similar central hole? Looks like one there. Yeah.
Sort, yeah.
Bingo, bingo. That hole has a name. It's called the hole in the vertebra, vertebral foramen, and that's a fancy phrase, vertebral foramen, and foramen's a word that just always means hole. So each of you found that very common feature. And those of you who may remember your sculptures, you too may have found a way to render that large central hole. The fancy name, the hole in the vertebra, vertebral foramen. That's the place where the spinal cord sits, inside each vertebra. Now there's a bunch of other things coming off of each of your sculptures. This one in particular looks spooky, and this one has things coming off. Anything that you're capturing here that you'd like to point to? Is it these?
Yeah. So yeah.
I suspect maybe these thumbs are.
The thumbs are almost like a arm.
They're going out this direction. Some of you may have captured something like that. Awesome. And then there's some other structures coming straight up and out.
I think that oh yeah, there it is. It's on that
Okay.
side.
Your
I was
lovely
interested in the
thumbs.
symmetry of
Lovely. So you've already discovered a fundamental principle of human anatomy, which is there are many structures that are the same on the right and left side. So he was creating symmetrical hand shapes. Your thumbs that look like sort of the hitchhiker's thumbs, if any of you captured those as well, those are called transverse processes, or bony parts that stick off in the transverse plane where that vertebra is housed. And you also identified that there were processes going in completely different planar directions. This one in the center, I think it's your two pinkies that are together, is called the spinous process. If you've ever felt bumps down the back of your spine, those are those spinous processes. So you're already beginning to think about the shapes of the vertebra and placing them in the context. So take a should we have them just real quickly check back in with theirs? Because we could do that. There are at least 5 basic structures that we typically hit in one of our workshops with this. But every single time, groups will hit processes that are sticking out in different directions, solid vertebral bodies or bases, big holes, and you've already begun to learn a lot of the fundamental principles of vertebral anatomy just by spending a little time doing it in a way that's very uncommonly approached in my kind of classroom. Certainly it's Kate's way.
And then the next thing that we would do if we were doing a full workshop in this is to ask you to create a sculpture of that specific vertebra with your whole body. So, Ellen, you want to do one really quick? I bet you could. Of yours? Mm-hmm. I'm picking on her because I know she can. Oops, sorry. So we would get, while she's thinking, I'll give you time. We would ask each person to use your whole body in a 3-dimensional sculpture for the vertebra that you have been given.
Probably do something with my elbows.
Mm-hmm. That would describe
my knees.
this feature here, most likely.
It's transverse processes.
Maybe have the bone part, maybe like my core because it's larger.
She's a vertebral body.
That's actually called a vertebral body, and you're using what you might identify as the core of your body to exemplify what is the core of a vertebra, which is the vertebral body. Yeah.
And then maybe use my neck or my head as the smaller section.
Mm-hmm.
I forget the spine.
Spinous process.
Spinous process.
Yeah.
Her neck coming up from it. Yeah, cool. And one of the things that we love about this is that every single person in the room will find a different way to do this. So that brings in the thing that artists are crazy for, which is individual voice and specificity of creativity. But it also still, each one in their own way finds a way to embody or to represent these very specific formal aspects of a vertebra.
I love it because it's 3-dimensional. It's not or 2 directions.
Yeah.
On a flat screen.
And then we would typically do kind of a sculpture garden where everybody travels around and looks at the different group. We have grouped you might notice, in regions of the spine. So this group is a lumbar region, the base region. Then there's a cervical group and a thoracic group, and we would have the thoracic people come and check out the cervical spine and check out, here we go. Some cervical people. We would quickly get to a point where people would notice, as they were looking at the separate sculpture gardens of the regions, people would start to notice, hey, what's different about this one than this one? And then we're able to talk about the lumbar being very large, sturdy, substantial vertebral bodies, the cervical vertebrae being light and airy with lots of holes and openings, and people get into very delicate shapes with that, whereas the lumbar people tend to really find
and the sacral
embody
people,
that.
especially with a large group, we can include the sacrum.
Yeah, so we can then talk about regional variations through the vertebral column, and that becomes, people start to really grasp that in a way that's different than looking at a drawing of it in a book. The next thing we would typically do, which maybe you can play with, is assembling your region. Who did I take that from, David? So how might you put these are the lumbar people, how might they stack them up? I have to give you yours back, sorry. How might you assemble them? So one of the first things you have to do is decide, in some anatomical language, what's superior, what's inferior, what's above, what's below, what's anterior in the front, what's posterior.
Totally superior.
Yeah, you think you're superior. Okay. Yeah, no, we make a joke about that. Yeah, the thoracic park. So that's a little disc that fits in between.
And for those of you who are I always hear people refer to I'll be the holder. The people who are using their hands to hold these together, you're taking on the role of many of the vertebral ligaments that are in fact in place around the vertebra to help things remain in place. Kate's got her bag of intervertebral discs that give us a little bit of spongy in between those vertebral bodies. And another thing we start to play with is these different regions have different kinds of mobility. And so if you go to start to twist or flex or extend the vertebral columns, you'll start noticing some differences in the regions just by actually physically constructing, experiencing, playing with it, and making sense of what you've got in your hands.
Then if we had more time
Yeah.
with the group, then we assemble all the regions together to make one spinal column, and lo and behold, curves start to emerge because of the way that they fit together. So then we can talk about the spinal curvatures and what they provide to the whole vertebral column. And then we would also create a spinal column of people connecting to one another and being able to move through space. So you'll see that in a little video that we have.
Absolutely.
All right? So we'll collect the models later on, but you can play with them for a little bit longer.
This is the way that we're currently, and we seek your input and your feedback as we transition to a 5-minute video of this sort of taking place at one of the locations where we've taken our workshops to. We're really exploring the embodied learning projects by very deliberately considering how many different sort of modes of learning or styles of learning or whatever terminology you want to attach to that are really present in this kind of learning environment. Again, Kate and I are quite passionate about, we always mix it up. The best thing in the room is have people that would regularly not be learning alongside persons that they've just met at those workshops. Places where Kate and I have been and have had great joy witnessing over the last year and a half. The responses have been here at JMU starting last fall, where we put pre-professional health students, very overachieving, very focused students in the classroom with dance majors, and that's where you heard the, oh my God, do I have to dance response, and the, oh my God, do we have to use the words, because you can imagine a dance student meeting a pre-professional pre-med student and wondering, oh, how is this going to go? It went swimmingly. Within 10 minutes, all of that was. We had the joy of having a poet with us during that phase as well, Elizabeth Hoover, who some of you may know well. We've done a CFI workshop in the fall in conjunction with Kate's and Claire Porter's residency here with us. Kate has done numerous years of work at White Mountain. This fall, we had the joy, Kate was on a delightful sabbatical, and we had the joy of going to the West Virginia School of Osteopathic Medicine in Lewisburg, West Virginia, where we were joined by faculty from that medical school and graduate teaching assistants, as well as members of the Trillium Performing Arts Collective from Lewisburg, and spent 2 days having a great time there, where we did heart, lungs, diaphragm, we did the spine. One of the things that came out of the CFI workshop was a great swallowing embodiment. So there were some really wonderful things about the body that are constantly moving, and tasks that each of you know, because you are each living, breathing human beings, that it's a lot of fun stepping into a setting where you're actually pulling those out. And then the 5-minute video that we'd love to show you here is one example of some work that we did last fall at Duke, where we added in some PT students and evolutionary anthropology and neuroscience students with massage students and members of the local community. So if you have any comments, I'm going to go switch to the video, hopefully with ease. If I can find my mouse, there it goes.
Spine that you feel like you want to explore a little bit, and or some reason why you feel the spine is important in your life and in whatever practices that you study. So you're making a little sculpture with your hands that conveys as much information as possible about the architecture of this crazy shape.
Look familiar?
Can you express the openings, the poking out places, the arches, the ridges? It's lovely. And then go back and create that sculpture with that much more specificity. Now you're going to do the same process with your whole body. So we need a little bit more space to move out from each other. A lot of space in between, a lot of open spaces. Right, travel, y'all. See it from many angles. At least at some point, you close your eyes and sense it from those whole proprioceptive sense of how the pieces are arranged.
I want you to think about those processes a little bit and speculate what those might be about. we go to the next component. 5 terms, you're okay. One more time, repetition, repetition. So the main solid part of your vertebra is called a vertebral body, good. The hole in it, the biggest hole, vertebral foramen. When we stick those together, we'll be doing that a little bit later. You might hear Kate and I slip into a term called the vertebral canal. It moves from being just one hole to having a whole bunch of holes lined up in that vertebral canal when we articulate the entire column. So towards your back, or the dorsal part of the body, you'll find on each vertebra a spinous process. And if you've ever felt the bumps as you're feeling down the back of your neck, so not only are you the base, essentially, the bedrock of the spinal column, but what else are you anchoring?
The pelvis.
The pelvis, and what's attached to the pelvis?
The legs.
Yes, okay, so there's a lot going on. Yeah. So here in L4, what do you want to do about that? Almost good.
And go from the size and the angle of it. If you need to use the numbers, I'm fine to do that. But if you can go for making it make sense from the fit, that's even better. Okay, go where it comes together. Notice how we're getting all these nice spinous processes aligned, right, down the back. That's one image that sometimes people use in aligning, say allow the spinous processes to drop downward. Yeah, so definitely we got a clear sense of the lumbar curve. The thoracic curve actually is going to curve posteriorly, and then the anterior curve of the cervical spine comes back in, and the noggin sits right here. Take us through the space.
I love how you can tell the member of the faculty who's the dance faculty member in the science. Can you still see that, I'm the one who's still a little bit more hesitant about embodying my teaching? There's all those sort of subtle realities behind what you see in the images. So with no further ado, if I can get this back to there, we've selected a few thoughts or responses from those diverse student learners that we've gotten back on some evaluation forms. These are some pretty powerful educational experiences being reported by students. It's never ceased to amaze us. Every single time we've stepped into a classroom with a different group of folks, the responses are really fundamentally different. So this is sort of where we'd love to open it up to you all, and feedback, questions, ideas, responses. Like I said, we've done heart, lungs, diaphragm, sort of swallowing the spine. I haven't even told Kate yet that I really want to think about peristalsis and sphincters, because I'm sort of thinking, okay, when you get to the full-length semester-long class, what else is moving? And the gut is constantly moving. And there are just some fundamental principles that I have seen anatomy students for 25 years just butt their heads with that are solved in an hour. And that video that you saw from Duke, that was a 1-hour workshop at the most, where you get through from start to finish in an hour with that level of sort of processing and integrating of information. I was shocked. We're all sort of, that's hard in the classroom to think, oh, what can we do in an hour? But every single time I've stepped into that setting have been blown away. The other piece is students report how much, and information and understanding and assimilation they experience in that sort of hour-long process. They're mystified by the sort of level of understanding, both physically, mentally, intellectually, and applications to their world that they walk away with. And that's worth keeping with this and moving forward. Yeah.
So I actually have a question. So this is a very compelling case for why the dance piece helps people who need, that helps sort of, pre-professional health students learn anatomy. Do you feel that this engagement with the representations of the spine moves the dance students forward in a similar way?
Oh, yes. Oh,
Yes, and part of it, I mean, the story that I like to share about it is that I tend to be very somatic in my teaching of anatomy for dancers, and I'm very low tech. You may have noticed she handed the remote to me for a minute, and I got nervous, like holding the remote. I gave it back as soon as I could, because anything that gets one step away from me, I start to get anxious. So when Sharon came in and taught my students as part of this project afterwards, several of them said, "You know, that was really cool that we had pictures on the wall about the bones and the muscle structures." And it's sort of like, I'm so low tech, I don't even do that. And they found that really, really helpful. And I thought, okay, yeah, there's stuff about the clinical approach and about the people who really know how to teach in that setting have something that really benefits my students and me as well.
So it made them better dancers?
Yes.
Okay.
It helped them understand the material. It just added another layer to the understanding that I had not really been addressing. And yes, so anytime they understand more about their bodies, they're going to dance more fully, I think. Yes.
To tie into that question, actually, I was curious about, it's like kind of, I don't know if this is a question or a statement, between the reflection on the body is like kind of an external impetus for conceptual framework for dancing. Do you think there's something that students are gleaning from that in regards to like how they conceptualize composing or choreography around like taking external information? Like that's the idea I always think about in relationship is, okay, if I'm thinking about performance and movement so much as grounded in my kind of presence, my mental state, how do I take other information systems and let that direct my movement?
You're jumping on.
And it may not be where you're necessarily going,
okay.
but what I like about what you both have said is it really is about the preliminary focus is either self or other. And in my world, it was always about other, right? Because you're not learning anatomy this way. It's the person you're thinking about learning their anatomy comes in this position. So health practitioners so often sort of view it as other that they forget that they've got the best laboratory and internal understanding experience that they don't tap. And so what I love is watching the folks who have that orientation towards other, realizing that it is in fact them. It's an expression of their self. And in some ways, I think it might be a little bit that opposite venue. And that's what I think is so wonderful about mixing these kinds of diverse learners, is you either start, and I don't want to be overgeneralizing, but that tends to be, it starts with either I'm viewing this from myself as an expression outward, or I'm viewing it as something else outside of me where I'm trying to gain understanding from outside.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I asked that is so much of the conversation in like the visual arts classes focus on strictly persons like feelings and emotions, and students kind of get locked in only being able to make work about themselves. In a sense, I'm curious about how the students are able to see that they're actually taking information about how the body moves and retranslating it into their movements. It's not really about them anymore at that point.
Yeah. And I would also say, I'm not sure that studying the body is external information. I think, so there's a pathway choice, that you're talking about, but one thing that I can report is
I always teach anatomy from the viewpoint that it will give a person more options as an artist, as a creator, as a choreographer, and as a mover. So for example, in anatomy, you study the planes of movement, which are very sort of mathy, sciencey,
Three-dimensional X, Y, Z.
geometry kind of oriented. But so when I teach the planes to dancers, I will ask them to notice, okay, which of these planes are you more apt to use in your general movement signature vocabulary? And some people will find, well, I'm a sagittal mover, man. This is what feels comfortable. Forward, back, sagittal mover. And then others are going to be more vertical plane movers, and that's what's natural for them, and others are going to be all about horizontal plane and twisting. So now that they know that those are the 3 planes of movement, they can go back in and say, you know, I'm always sagittal, man. It's so boring in my choreography. Maybe if I mix it in, add a horizontal plane movement here, it's going to create a wider range of options for me, and hence more expressive, hence more powerful as a maker of movement. So I think that gets to what you're talking about a little bit too, that when you can broaden your construct beyond just what is your innate way of moving, so the external information or the framework of information is giving them more options as creators and movers too.
I can't get science students to think that way or move that way. And that's where they start in dance.
That's my question, and kind of feeding off of that. In a dance practice, in a movement practice, that's really apparent to acknowledge the types of movement and which ways feel innately more comfortable to them, and they can relate that to an understanding of the more anatomical background or structure of that movement. From a scientific perspective, how do they find ways to branch out through? Because they know the types of movement already. They know what does what on a structural level. How do they find ways to branch out? It could be in a creative sense or in an even non-creative sense. Just how do they expand their knowledge in a similar way?
I guess what I'm wanting to say initially from student perspective and watching the change in the interaction is their confidence to explore what they've always pondered more about skyrockets. So they're simply more ready to ask the questions that they may not have been able to find a way to verbalize before, or had felt that the population of persons who might understand the kind of question they're asking was so limited that now maybe it was bigger and there are different perspectives. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I would also say that we do we share a sort of belief that an environment of play and experimentation and humor really enables people from all the different areas to feel more ready to try something new or just to play with something. So we try to encourage, the pre-professional health students. I think sometimes they get kind of they start intimidated, but then they realize, hey, in this space, these people like play around with stuff and can laugh at stuff and vice versa, that the students from my orientation get inspired by the depth of knowledge, prior understanding that the others have, and they're very eager to tap into that. Question more with that, Karen.
Yeah. Do you see a need for more non-traditional teaching spaces? I'm assuming that was the dance studio. That was beautiful.
Yeah, that's the Arc. It's a very historic building for dance. Yeah.
The original gymnasium for the Blue Devil basketball.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
But have you ever tried to teach this way in a lecture hall setting?
Yeah. At the College of Osteopathic Medicine, we were in sort of a lecture hall kind of space, and I mean, it's nice to have, it's ideal to have a studio space with a nice wooden floor where people are free to get on the floor and move around, but also have it mediated with technology.
My Bio 290 students, when we get to the limbs, they're up and we're stepping on backpacks, chairs, tables, but we're moving. And so it is tight because things are very sort of set up with chairs and tables, and it's hard to find the free space to allow the movement and that sort of play. So it is something that I do grapple with when I'm in my classroom without Kate and with those other learners. I'm always one of these anyway. I mean, I've always sort of just tried to encourage my students to move, but a lot of the times we create spaces that are physically limiting.
Yeah, and you just saw that we had to kind of mess around with this space a little bit because typical teaching spaces are not set up for interaction, for one thing. And this is a very interactive way of teaching where people need to be able to, turn and at least get oriented in an interactive way.
I was just thinking, and maybe you've had experience with this, but it must be really interesting to explore between two disciplines, especially like science and dance, that are so predominantly gendered.
Yes. Yes.
And sort of how the gender dynamic plays into this on top of the different learning styles.
Yes, and when we
didn't really see that in the video. I mean, that dynamic at all. So that's why I was curious.
Yeah, and when we were recruiting people from PPH to participate in this, they were all women, the ones who volunteered and wanted to get involved in this. And I think it was partly that thing of dance was in the name of it. There's, So that immediately self-selects in a lot of ways that that the people, many of the PPH people who participated had danced before in their earlier lives, and that's going to be more typically female than male. So,
But my anatomy classroom is still predominantly female to begin with. I'm thinking right now, just this semester in my 2 labs, I have I have a phenomenal overload of young men, 5 out of 24 in that lab, and the other one's usually 1 or 2. So it's not atypical on this campus for just my experiences to sort of be predominantly female.
and I think that the gender issue is really, I don't know, I think it is changing, but that certainly has come up a lot in our conversations about my early fears about science. I'm of a generation where, I had 2 brothers and a sister, and when we sat around the dinner table, the guys talked about how things work and how to fix things and, mechanical engineering, sciencey kinds of things. And the females were really getting messages that we understood the arts and feelings and girly things like that, And I know that my early fear about anatomy and science was very gender defined. I think my students are not quite so hung up like that, but it's still, the numbers in the classroom are extremely gender oriented.
I had a question. I cannot believe I'm asking this question, but for some reason this little voice in my head. So two length questions. One is the question of who this class is for and who this experience is for. So I remember a couple of years ago there was this big rave in art history because they were so excited because someone at Columbia had decided it was a great idea to have people do art historical analysis of paintings in a med school setting. So med students would carefully do visual analysis because that was something they really, really needed when they got in the operating room. It was very handy for them to have to look very, very closely at things. And then these skills were transferable, and all the art historians were like, "Yay, we matter, we help med schools, yay!" And then that kind of wave dissipated. But so the first question is like, is the ideal here, oh my God, it would be so fantastic if every single dance student and every single public health student had this experience and it would make them better, and so what we really like to do is scale this and have it be like something that becomes a required part of the curriculum. So that's the first question. And the second question that's linked to that is, the experience here is one that's very special and unique and very difficult to quantify in terms of its benefits and the metrics and the assessment. And I'm just, there's the voice in my head, which I know that upper administrators are likely to say, which is, okay, how do you know if they actually learn any anatomy? And how do you know are they actually going to learn more anatomy in this? Or are they going to get a third of the content and have all this frilly stuff? And so those are my 2 questions.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of conversations with Ed Brantmeyer at CFI, who's really encouraging us to do more measuring, and we've started to do more of that. We have a questionnaire that we asked all the participants in these things that we were doing over the fall. Do you want to talk a little bit about how we were framing those questions? Which of these sorry.
Well, and no, it's fine. I think collectively we might remember we went through so many permutations on just that feedback sheet about how to capture, sort of identify the kinds of things that we wanted specific feedback about, but not also to tunnel that so much on perception of what we think they might get versus what we want them to get. And I think we've sort of let the cat out of the bag from the feedback that we've talked about. It's just so novel. I think a lot of times they're just sort of still in that space about this is just a different way to learn, that they're still in that sort of out of box. And the only group we've had for a sequential period of time was the JMU group for a series of 5 sequential workshops. 5 hours together. So that layers on. I certainly know that when I talk later to the science students who have been through this, and I'm going to take it out of anatomy, and I'm going to go to organic chemistry, okay? The one student, Kelsey, one of your majors, who was a pre-med student, here's an example. Kelsey rocked in organic chemistry because she understood 3-dimensional space, because she was a dancer, and she understood movement. And organic is so much about interactions and changes in the positions of entities that Kelsey's strength in that arena was, whew. And if you'd asked her or her peers or probably her faculty if that was going to be, what does dance have to do with organic chemistry, our preconception might be very little. And so I think we also have to be careful about the way we ask those questions about when is that impact going to take place and how. And that's my bent on that, and I don't know if you had some other.
Well, I'm trying to remember that feedback. We realized as we were making this feedback form, we tried to identify the different forms of learning that we were aiming for, or the different forms of teaching. And, and we came up with like 8 or 9, learning from, diagrams, visual representations, learning from tactile exploration of, because we use a lot of the bone models, 3-dimensional bone models, learning from embodying something with your full body, learning from
I think the teamwork.
the collaborative kind of approach. So we kind of identified 8 or 9 sort of approaches that we were including in the workshops, and we asked people to rate, which of those do you feel was most impactful for you? Seeing the performance, like seeing seeing those concepts embodied in a creative performance form. So just looking at, trying to get a sense of which of those elements they felt was most impactful for their learning of that material. So that was one way we were trying to gather some information.
Yeah, no, that answers.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that one thing that we've discovered as we were talking about it, that as an art person, I have always had this huge, like the minute somebody says assessment, measure, my immediate reaction is, no, get it out of my space. I have always felt as a person in the arts that has nothing to do with it. And that, you're a what? Mathematician?
Skeptical of anything that's facts of social science.
Okay.
My voice is
Okay.
like that. As another mathematician, a lot of the measures are, the tape is rolling. Okay.
Let's just say there's a collective eye roll.
Okay.
Whole
Yeah.
department.
And yet,
Right.
and yet I'm also realizing that knee-jerk reaction of total animosity towards that concept comes from, as an artist, you train that process is where you got to stay. And if you go into the studio to create something and you're thinking product, then you're going to get nothing. So as artists, we really are oriented towards valuing process, and there's something about the culture of our education in the arts which is fundamentally different from the culture of an education that has more openness to that idea of measuring and assessing. And I'm coming to realize that there may be more synergy than I thought initially.
I hate to say this.
We're out of time.
We're over time.
I gotta go teach.
I think I probably sadly have to cut it off. But are you here for couple
I have to go
questions,
teach
or-
a 125 class, but
Sharon can
well
do
then,
it.
sadly, thank you so much.
thank you. Thanks, David.